Today, we're joined by Zolal Habibi, an Iranian human rights activist focused on democracy and women's rights in Iran. Zolal serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, where she works internationally to advocate for a free, secular, and democratic Iran. With more than 2 decades of experience, she has helped bring the voices of political prisoners, dissidents, and everyday Iranians living under repression to global audiences through international forums, human rights conferences, and major media platforms. Her activism is deeply personal. As a teenager, Zola lost her father, a respected Iranian writer and political dissident, who was killed by the regime during the 1988 mass executions. That loss shaped her life and set her on a path to ensure that the victims of repression are not erased and that their stories are heard. Zolal's work has led to tangible life saving outcomes, including helping secure international recognition of the 1988 massacre as a crime against humanity and contributing to the safe relocation of more than 3,000 Iranian dissidents from Iraq. Zolal, thank you for being here. Let's start with, how did you get started and why has this work mattered so much to you?
Well, first of all, let me greet everyone who's tuning into the podcast and thank you for this opportunity to be able to speak about the current situation in Iran specifically. Well, as you mentioned, I've practically been born into this movement and also the situation. I've actually never had the chance to actually go to Iran. I was born and raised in the US. My parents came to the US before the revolution as students, but they were active and very soon after the revolution that they had so much hopes for. Unfortunately, they realized that their revolution had been stolen by the mullahs, and so the reign of terror began. And my father, as a human rights activist and a writer, he was always working on the situation in Iran. So I got introduced to the human rights violations in Iran when I was just about 4 or 5 years old. And that really made an impact on the way I saw the world and the situation in Iran, and realizing very early on that, living in a democracy, living in freedom is a privilege that not everyone has, unfortunately, even though it should be a basic right. It made me um, hold dear having those freedoms and being able to, live in a free society. But also, it made me realize how lucky I am to be able to have that opportunity. So very early on, I really wanted to be able to give that possibility to others. Even as a child, it was very important for me that, other kids my age, they shouldn't be suffering the way they are in Iran. But as you mentioned, in summer of 1988, at the time I was only 7, and well, there was a massacre in Iran, and 30,000 political prisoners were executed. That summer, the Iranian regime also had my father killed. You know, that really changed everything for me. I've started to realize that the Iranian regime sees no boundaries when it comes to keeping its grip on power. They will go to whatever extents needed just to be able to keep their grip on power. And that's what we're seeing today in Iran too, and the massacre that we've seen in the last month in Iran. And well, I mean, from that point on, I think due to my circumstances and due to the situation that I had, I became more involved step by step while I grew up, because I had this understanding of what is going on, and I had the understanding of what people in Iran are suffering from, even though I was not living there. And so, as you said, I think my activism began as a teenager, as at a time that I personally, based on my own choices and, you know, I started becoming active and, as an activist, started going to back then to the US Congress and doing this and that and trying to do whatever I can to echo the voice of the Iranian people. And then, I mean, a bit down the line, after graduating from high school, I had gotten a full scholarship to go and study medicine. That was my plan. That was the roadmap. If you know Iranians, they're usually either, um, you know, pursuing medicine, becoming a lawyer, or, a engineer. That's like the things that Iranian families push their children towards. But so I was going along that path, but the summer of 1999, the student uprisings broke out in Iran, and that was the first uprising in Iran after, the 1980s, um, that really made an impact on me. And it was the first time that it was being broadcasted. The world was seeing what was happening. It was the beginning of, cable TV and whatnot. People were seeing the images from Iran for the first time and this uprising. And I remember thinking, I can't be just a bystander and just watch this from the television. I need to do something to be part of that group that makes that change. So then Iranians, both inside of Iran and the diaspora, could go and actually serve their people. So that was the minute that I made that decision to join the resistance. And 26 years on, I am a member of the Iranian resistance now, and I have dedicated my life to the cause of freedom in Iran.
That's quite a story. I can't imagine the things that you've seen and heard and been a part of. I noticed that you distinctly separated the Iranian targeting of your father from the 1988 massacre. Is that because he wasn't part of the prisoners, but he just happened to be in country at the time? I mean, I don't mean to be insensitive. If it's a sensitive topic, I apologize.
No, no, no. That's exactly it. My father was not in prison at the time, and but he was a target of the regime for years, actually. Uh, Unfortunately, like my father was killed in the border area of Iran and Iraq. So, but at that
Hmm.
time, I mean, even if you look like in the years that followed, some of my father's colleagues who were all members of the NCRI were assassinated by the regime in the different countries that they were working, be it in Rome, in Geneva, in Turkey. So unfortunately, there have been over 500 terrorist attacks and assassinations carried out by the Iranian regime throughout these years abroad, and they have been mostly targeting Iranian dissidents.
Which, I mean, that's par for the course for Iran, and they tend to not care about international boundaries when it comes to terrorism or their own specific policies. I didn't want to be insensitive with that question. Just wanted to understand the separation there. So I guess the next question I have for you is to kind of, and I'm a person that has this desire to understand true lines, how we got here. What is it, or can you walk us through the key moments in Iran's current, like the modern history, including US involvement, that shaped the current regime? Like, how did Iran get to the point that it is at now? Because, I mean, if I remember correctly, there was a time where Iran was very pro West and very, very partnership with the West, kind of in the same way that the West is now lined up with Saudi Arabia. So, what was it that caused that split in for Iran to take the path that it is currently taking?
If you look in Iran's modern history, like the last century, we have seen two dictatorships under like four leaderships, but two dictatorships. So it was the current regime, the mullahs, and then before it, it was the Shah and the Pahlavi dynasty. And well, you have to understand like how did the Pahlavi dynasty come into play? Well, there was a Reza Khan who was a someone from the military that the British actually came and installed in Iran because he would do their bidding. And so he was serving British interest and not Iranian interests necessarily. So he was brought in. He wanted to show the West that he is aligned with them. So he did take certain steps that, I mean, to be able to modernize Iran based on what he was saying, but it was really implementing his dictatorship at that time. Um, I mean, once he wasn't serving that purpose anymore, he was taken out again by the British, and when he was sent to um, South Africa, I believe, at the time, at the beginning of it, and then, but he was sent into exile, right? And then his son was brought in. And then there was the coup d'etat in 1953 against Dr. Mossadegh. Dr. Mossadegh was the only democratic government that Iran has ever seen. He nationalized oil and he was pushing for the prosperity of Iran and Iranians because at the time, even though Iran is a rich country in oil, but over 80% of its oil income was going to foreign interests, and the people of Iran were not seeing any of it, to be honest. And in fact, it was, it was considered to be, the investment or like belonging to these, the US and the British oil companies and whatnot. He nationalized oil. That was not something that the British and the US wanted to see. And unfortunately, they carried out a coup d'etat against Dr. Mossadegh in 1953 and then reimposed Reza Pahlavi, sorry, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. And since that moment, the Shah ruled with an iron fist because he knew that, this state is not something that he can really count on unless he has complete grip over the situation. So he created the Savak and then he turned Iran into a one party system to make sure that nothing like Dr. Mossadegh comes out of it again. And, the Savak was notorious for its executions and its killings and its torture. And people were, I mean, in comparison to today, they may have had some freedoms or whatnot. But even back then, people were, they were living in poverty. They didn't have any political rights. So they were living under a dictatorship and they just wanted to see an end to that. So that's why we saw the revolution in 1979. At the time, it was the Cold War era. So what was clear to the international community was the Shah is not going to be able to keep its grip on power, especially after opening fire on the peaceful protesters on September 8th, 1978, which led to just in Tehran, in one square, over 1,000 people were killed. But the people continued their protests. And that was a sign to the Shah that he's not going to be able to keep his grip on power when people are taking such risks and coming to the streets. And the Western governments, they had a conference in Guadeloupe in France, and that's where they were, discussing who comes next if the Shah falls. And at the time, because it was the Cold War, their main issue was what do we do that, progressive movements or left or whatnot don't come into power who might be aligned with USSR or more aligned with the USSR than the Western powers, just because of that history that Iran has had after at that time. Like, you have to understand 1979, 1953 was still fresh in people's minds, and the coup d'etat and everything.
Hmm.
What do we do about that? So they brought in Khomeini, was in exile in Najaf in Iraq at the time. They brought him to France about 6 months before the revolution, and he came to France, and there they said, well, he's our choice because he's a religious man, he's a fundamentalist. So he has his, limits with the USSR. So that is what serves our purpose, right? And unfortunately, soon after Khomeini came, he went against everything that he had said in that 6 months in France, because when he was in France, he was saying, yes, I mean, everyone will have freedoms, there will be political freedoms. I don't want to have anything to do with power. I'm just going to go to Rome and continue my studies. And no, it's going to be, people's sovereignty and whatnot. But the reality is, the minute that he came to Tehran, everything changed. There's that historic video. Actually, this week is the anniversary of his return to Iran, unfortunately. But they ask him, what is your feeling returning to Iran after 20 years of being in exile? And he's like, I have no feelings whatsoever. That was the reality of Khomeini, that he didn't care about the people of Iran or the country. And that is why he started his reign of terror very early on. And we are where we are because of that. So, in fact, the reality is that those who created the revolution, they were all still in the prisons of the Shah till January 20th, 1979. They were in the last set of political prisoners to be released. And so by the time they came out of prison, it was already too late. So they had paid the price for this revolution. They were the ones who had led this revolution. But unfortunately, it was hijacked by Khomeini, who was instated by Western powers at the time, not knowing the Western powers, not knowing what Khomeini would turn into, like enemy number one at some point in time against them. And right now, unfortunately, Iran is the number one state sponsor of terrorism. And unfortunately, many countries have suffered from Iran's warmongering and terrorism, both in the region and internationally. And that is what has led us to this moment where we are today. The reality is, now, after 47 years, next week marks the anniversary of the 1979 revolution. But in these 47 years, I think what's really important to state is that the people of Iran have never given in to this regime. They have continuously fought. They have continuously stood against the regime. And I think that is something that's noteworthy because there has been a organized resistance throughout this whole process. And I think that today we are seeing how it, step by step, there have been a lot of obstacles in the way, especially because unfortunately the policy of the West toward Iran has been a policy of appeasement. And the people of Iran, and specifically the Iranian resistance, have been used as the bargaining chips at these tables from the 1980s till today. So the people of Iran have paid a grave price for it. But I think what's important is that they've never given in and they've never given up. And today we have reached a point that even the regime itself knows that it has reached a point of no return. There's no way that Khamenei can go back to December 27th and 25. The past month, what we have seen in Iran is a new chapter. The reality is everyone always thought that Khamenei doesn't have the strength to be able to carry out a massacre the way that Khomeini used to. But unfortunately, what we saw in the past month is that when it comes to making sure that he can keep his grip on power, he is willing to have such a massacre too. And that is what we witnessed. The numbers right now, they differ because unfortunately it's very hard to verify the actual number of people who were killed, especially since there was a 19-day internet blackout. And then aside from the blackout, there is also very limited connection. Even right now, it's like 50% internet connection. And the issue is that because everyone was disconnected, it's very hard to be able to verify everyone. Even inside of Iran, all communication lines were broken. So people weren't even able to communicate with their friends, families in the country. So everyone just knows like what happened in their area or what they saw themselves. So it's difficult to verify those numbers right now, but that is something that we are working on and we're trying to put together. But it is thousands and thousands of people who have been killed and over 50,000 people who have been detained and their lives are in danger right now. The Iranian regime is threatening with executions, but the regime feels so threatened that even like there was a audio file that came out yesterday. It's the son of the former Iranian ambassador to Australia, I believe. He says, "Why didn't you kill them all on the streets? What are you going to do with these many people that you've arrested? You can't execute 50,000 people because then EU and European Parliament and this and that, they're going to get on our case for every execution. But if you had killed them in the streets, it had been done, it was a done deal." And that is the mentality of this regime. Unfortunately, some of the reports that we're receiving are very devastating from on the scene. People have been reporting that when they went to the morgues to be able to collect or search for their loved ones or collect their bodies, some heard voices coming out of the morgue. And they're like, look, some of these people are still alive. And they're like, well, we're going to let them die. We're not going to let anyone out of here alive. And
Oh my gosh.
people were brought in with these 18-wheeler trucks full of bodies were being brought in to Kahrizak, and people, reported that, people saw, there were people who saw this is, after days that there were already thousands of bodies in Kahrizak, they saw four, 18-wheeler trucks bringing in more bodies. And, the regime is trying to spread fear. And there's a lot of parallels when you look at it to the early 90s and what Khomeini did then. Because back then there was also a peaceful protest on June 20th, 1981, which is a turning point in our history because that's when the Iranian resistance and the people of Iran realized that this regime is not going to be able to bear any kind of peaceful, reform. It's not, it's going to reform is going to be met with bullets and bloodshed, and that the reign of terror has really actually started since then. So we're seeing that right now and that repetition. So there's a lot of parallels when you look at the facts, look at the things that are happening. The fact that the regime is charging families for the bullets they used to kill their loved ones in exchange to receive the body and things of that nature. The regime is trying to spread fear this way, but what is interesting is I was speaking to someone today in Tehran, and she was saying that what was remarkable in this wave of uprisings and protest is the hope that you saw in people's eyes and the defiance. And you saw people were on the offensive instead of being on the defense. They were disarming, the suppressive forces. They were organized on the ground. They were working together. You could see that there were, groups of, youth who came together. They organized together. They made sure that they had each other's back. And so that way they were able to push forward. And she said you could feel like a new sense or a new culture of resistance in the people. And she said even these days that, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people who there's a lot of videos that are surfacing on social media too. People are saying, the streets smell of blood because there's been so much killing. Like someone was a shopkeeper was washing the street in front of the sidewalk in front of his store, and when he was washing it, you could see blood being washed away, and people were commenting on that. But she was saying, despite of all the brutal suppression, you don't see fear in people's eyes. You see anger now. You see this resolute atmosphere in among the people that they're saying, look, this is not the end, this is the beginning. And that is like one of the messages that we've been getting a lot in the past few days. People who call in to be it give a report of their city or what is happening on the ground, or just to let us know that they're fine. They're telling their both from the reports that we're receiving and from the calls with their families, everyone is saying, look, tell everyone that this is not finished. We're still continuing, just in different forms. We can't gather and protest the way that you saw last month because there's like a martial law atmosphere and or martial law unannounced, but it's being implemented, and especially in the major cities. But people are turning every situation in a way to define the regime. Like, for instance, turning the memorial ceremonies or the burials or whatnot into an act of resistance. There's a lot of clashes still being reported in different parts of major cities, Tehran, Mashhad, and whatnot. So they have really made that decision because they have lost so much. They know that we can't let these lives be lost in vain. If we don't push again, it'll take like a few years and it'll buy the regime time, and then you have to start over and be able to push
Mhm.
again. So we have to make sure that we continue this. I mean, a revolution never happens overnight. It's a process. But I think what we are seeing is that we are seeing that avalanche come together, and hopefully it'll lead to the overthrow of the regime soon. I mean, even with the Shah, it took 18 months for it to be overthrown from the
Mhm.
from the day that the Shah stopped execution and torture, because President Carter had the human rights diplomacy, and he ordered him to stop execution and torture, thinking that, well, that will help lessen the hatred of the people toward the Shah, and that way he can be that island of stability that they were looking for. But he didn't know that it was already too late, because he had already killed so many people, and everyone knew how everyone saw the circumstances, so it was already too late, and it didn't save his reign. So the mullahs have learned one lesson from the Shah, and that was, don't stop execution and torture till the last minute. And that is what we're seeing the continuation of. Just in 2025, there are over 2,200 executions in Iran. And just this month, in the month of January, there were over 284 executions carried out, aside from the demonstrations and the protests and everything that was going on. And that's the part that we have recorded, but because there was that disconnect due to the internet and communication blackout, that the numbers are probably higher, but this is what we have been able to record.
So I got two questions, I guess. The first one is, you said that the West installed Khomeini. And when I look at the timeline, and I ask this because I know that a lot of Americans, particularly my age or older, remember the Iran hostage crisis, which happened in 79. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that happened under or as part of the whole turnover process that Khomeini was leading, correct?
It did happen under Khomeini. It was a few months after the revolution. So this is interesting angle and aspect that I'd like to share. Khomeini, he came with a lot of promises that he knew he didn't want to keep. But the people who had created that revolution, they had a lot of hopes and dreams, and they weren't willing to just let those go. I mean, there's a speech by Mr. Masoud Rajavi, leader of the Iranian resistance, 4 days after he was released from prison, which was on he was released on January 20th, 1979. This is January 24th, and it's at Tehran University. And there he says, "Long live the democratic revolution of the Iranian people." He didn't say Islamic revolution. And that was when Khomeini realized that, we're not going, when these paths are not going to cross. And, because he was like, you're supposed to be a Muslim force. Why do you not support an Islamic state or Islamic republic? And he said, no, the people of Iran revolted for democracy. They did not revolt for Islam. So you have to understand that with it, like any other revolution, practically, it's usually more the youth, the elite, the educated who are the pioneers, and because they are the ones who have progressive views, right? So the people who had created this revolution, they had these progressive views and they wanted to move forward. And Khomeini was like the 180-degree opposite of those ideals. So he knew that very soon these clashes are going to break out and he's going to have to respond to them. He's going to have some kind of a reaction. So he needed something to divert attention from the internal situation of Iran and to create some kind of a smokescreen in a way that would rally people around the flag in a sense. So he moved on to two things. If you look at the timings, they're very close to one another. One is the bus hostage taking, and one is the start of the Iran-Iraq war. They are within a few months of one another. And simultaneously, inside of Iran, what we're seeing is what he called the Cultural Revolution, which he shut down all universities for 3 years throughout Iran. So this regime has always moved forward on two legs. One is suppression internally. The second is export of terrorism and fundamentalism, what they call export of revolution. Khamenei, just 10 years ago, there's a video of him. He says, if we don't fight in Syria, Baghdad, Lebanon, we're going to have to fight in the streets of Tehran, Shiraz, and Isfahan. So that is why we need these foreign wars, right? So with the US hostage taking, Khomeini wanted to present himself as the flag bearer of those who stand in face of capitalism and imperialism and whatnot, to be able to rally support both from those who had like leftist leniencies back then or were opposed to the imperialism, because at the time it was like, you have to remember, is Vietnam War, all of that. I mean, the
Mhm.
situations were very different, and to be able to get make it be like, are you with us or are you with them? You try to create that kind of a line, because a lot of Iranians, maybe they disagreed with the hostage taking, but they weren't willing to make a statement against it because, you know, you're against the state, you're standing by the US, or what are you, a puppet of the US, or what are you this, or what are you that? I think one of the only movements that actually made a statement back then was the MEK, that they opposed the hostage crisis. And then, so with that, Khomeini was able to buy time because there was a foreign enemy. So everyone had to stay quiet internally because otherwise you're giving aid to the foreign enemy. With the Iran-Iraq war, it was the same thing. I mean, the Iran-Iraq war could have ended in 1983 when Iraq pulled out of Iranian soil completely. But Iraq did agree to a peace treaty, which was presented by the Iranian resistance. The National Council of Resistance of Iran had a peace plan that was presented to the United Nations, and over 5,000 parliamentarians around the world actually supported it back then. But yeah, Saddam or Iraq agreed to it. Khomeini said, no, we're going to continue this war to the last house standing in Tehran, because the path to Jerusalem goes through Karbala, right? And war is a holy, he had a quote, he said, war is a holy gift that has been given to us or whatnot. And so he continued the war for 8 years until the moment that he saw that if he continues this war, he might it's not an issue anymore of losing one province of Iran, because that was the issue with Iran-Iraq war, that Iran might lose one province of Iran. But he felt threatened by the Iranian resistance, which was at the time the National Liberation Army was in Iraq and it was carrying out operations. Khomeini felt like, look, the next operation is going to be Tehran. So I need to end this war to be able to close the borders. And that is why he said, I drank the chalice of poison. And he
Hmm.
never, to this day, Iran has not signed a peace treaty in regards to the Iran-Iraq war. It's still a ceasefire because
I did not know that.
that was the
That's
propaganda that
interesting.
Khomeini used. Because you have to also understand, like, by doing these, he also created, because he didn't have, after a while, especially after 1981, with the execution started and everything, Khomeini lost, those who saw him in the moon back then and thought he was holy and this and that. They're like, oh no, he's a killer and he's, bloodthirsty. So people started seeing his true face. It did take a while, unfortunately, because we can't look at it. We have to understand those times. There wasn't the technology that we have today that people can become informed and learn about, what's going on. So it took a while for people to realize. But after that, he didn't have public support in Iran. So he needed that, support to come from somewhere. So he wanted to
Mhm.
show himself as the leader of the Arab world or the Muslim world or whatnot, to be able to, have that kind of support. And that's when right now even Khamenei relies on. He relies on Hezbollah's support. He tries to present himself as, someone who, that the regime cares about Palestine, even though they are an enemy of Palestine in reality. But to be able to, you know, utilize that and to try to buy some kind of legitimacy for themselves. I mean, right now, even when you just look at the last month, there are those in the US who won't stand against this regime and what it's doing. They're turning a blind eye because they think that, there are foreign players in the play here. And Iran is the country that supports, the movements in the Middle East. And that's not true. That's not the reality. This regime is a brutal regime that not only the people of Iran have felt that it has created, but also in the region and also entire world really has suffered from Iran's terrorism and export of fundamentalism. So that's the background of
So
the U.S. hostage taking.
that clarifies a lot. I really do appreciate that. And my next question on this topic is, um, even growing up, I mean, I was in just entering high school, 99, 2000, and I remember back then hearing about the protests that were occurring in Tehran and Iran, and at the time I had no idea where this country was. And the privilege of being an American. But as I grew up and as I joined the Marine Corps, I did deploy to Iraq. I learned about Iran. I learned about the differences between Iranians and Arabs and what that difference is. I learned about the Sunni and the Shia infighting. But what I always noted was the consistent and almost cyclical process of the uprisings. They would rise up and US would talk, all about helping them and supporting them. And then it would just pull back at the last minute, which would cause or allow for the regime to crack down. And then the crackdown would last, things would go quiet for a little bit, and then it would rise up and we would go through that same process. Do you think that had the United States provided assistance earlier in the process, in the uprisings, that the revolution could have had more of a lasting impact? That's the first part of the question. The second part is, with every uprising, I call it uprising, but every rise in tensions, does the resistance learn more about how to effectively resist against and potentially result in a change of regime in Iran?
I think those are two really good questions, actually. In regards to the first question, the reality is that, as I mentioned before, uh, it's not only an issue that they haven't stood by the people of Iran or they haven't given assistance, is the fact that they've actually always used the Iranian people as bargaining chips in the negotiations with the Iranian regime and the Iranian resistance. And that is what has prevented the overthrow of the regime to this day. To be completely honest, the situation would have been completely different if specifically the US, but also Europe, had not made some wrong decisions back, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, when it comes to the Iranian resistance. And I think we would have seen the overthrow of the regime decades earlier. But that's a whole story that is not going to fit in our timing right now. But the reality is that even right now, unfortunately, the governments, they may give statements in regards to, statements of condemnation or solidarity with the people of Iran, the condemnation of the crimes perpetrated by the regime, the fact that, so many have been killed, but in action, it's really not their issue that people of Iran are being killed, unfortunately. Even right now that they're speaking about negotiations with Iran, it's in regards to Iran's nuclear program. It's not in regards to the fact that the regime just committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in the last month, but it's not being held accountable by the international community whatsoever. So when the people of Iran ask or want, help from Western governments, what they're asking for really is, just certain concrete steps. We don't want foreign intervention. We don't want troops on the ground. We don't want any of that because we have that experience. Unfortunately, we have the negative experience of it if you look in the past 100 years in Iran. So the people of Iran, they're like, you know what? We have a saying in Farsi. We say, no one's going to scratch your back except your own finger. We know that no one can just freedom and a silver platter. We know that if any country decides to help Iran, it's not going to be without some kind of an interest or something that they want in return. So we would prefer to have our sovereignty and to be able to do it, independently. Have our independence is really important. But what we're asking for is like specific things. Recognize the Iranian people's right to resist. Shut down Iran's terror embassies around the world. Limit your, or halt your economic ties with the regime or make them in exchange for the release of, all political prisoners or the stop of the executions or whatnot, hold the regime accountable for its crimes instead of turning a blind eye on it. Because the reality is that the Iranian regime, they talk about this very openly, actually. They say, look, all these governments, they have, the Western governments, they have elections. So this president is going to be in office for 4 years or 5 years or 8 years or whatnot. And then it's going to finish. So what we have to do is we have to last for that 4 years. He is there the entire time, Khamenei. So what have they been doing? They're playing this card really, smartly. And they're just saying we just have to buy time till the next administration, and we could do that. And unfortunately, as I said, the people of Iran are paying that price. And the regime has become very smart in reading between the lines. They get the messages. They see, okay, they understand that you have to give words of condemnation. It doesn't bother them. They're like, yeah, we understand, because of people's reaction, you can't be silent. So it's fine. But the fact that they know that they're not going to be held accountable, it gives them that message that, okay, this is the green light. I can suppress the people, kill them, whatever is needed to keep, myself afloat. You're going to just give some words of condemnation and then business as usual. The fact that, just a few weeks ago, we had the World Economic Forum in Davos. They actually invited Araghchi, the foreign minister of the Iranian regime, despite the fact that it was, I think, during the first week of the internet blackout and all communication blackout, so phone lines, everything was down. Everyone knew that thousands of people had just been killed within a few days, but still he was welcome at the World Economic Forum. The only reason they canceled it like 2-3 hours before he arrived, and that was only because of the pressure that was being placed by the Iranian diaspora on the World Economic Forum, and it wasn't a good look for them. So they're like, okay, you know what? Maybe it's best if you don't come. But the regime got the message. They're like, okay, so you're fine with it. We're fine with it. You're fine with it. Let's move on. They get the message. Right now, even with the negotiations, they're like, fine, we'll negotiate. And everyone is like, okay, so we're going to negotiate now. Of course, negotiation means you're going to give and take. It doesn't mean you're holding the regime accountable. And that is what the world is seeing. As you mentioned, in all of these protests, you see, in 2009, I heard, on the streets in Tehran, people were saying, Obama, are you with us? Are you with them? Fortunately, President Obama gave a message, an actual message, and he said, I extend my hands to Khamenei. So that was clear. And every other president, it doesn't really make a difference, unfortunately, Democrat, Republican. At the end of the day, This is what we have seen in recent years. But in regards to the uprisings and what are the people of Iran or the resistance learning from it, or how is it moving forward? Yes, I think that step by step, and every uprising you see it evolve. These protests, especially like in the last 10 years, we've had four major uprisings: 2017, 2019, 2022, and today. And if you look a bit back, I mean, 1999, 2009, the time in between each one is becoming shorter. So it used to be like once every decade that this would happen. Now it's happening like once every few years. The methods are evolving, the slogans are evolving, and you see this transformation. So, like for instance, in 2017, and each one you could find one issue that has been set in stone then during those protests, and then you next time you build up on that each time. So, like for instance, 2017 was reform is hardliner, the game is over. That was the message. Or like for instance, in 2019, people started realizing the importance of responding back to the suppressive forces. There was a slogan in Iran that we're going to answer fire with fire. And you saw that. And that's why the regime was so brutal and immediately reacted back then. And then in 2022, it was the extensiveness of the protest and the fact that it was throughout Iran, all the different ethnicities and everyone joined in. It wasn't just certain cities or certain provinces getting involved. And this time around, first of all, it was the entirety of Iran that did get joined in. Yes, it did take a few days for some of the areas to join in, and that was because, unfortunately, some divisions that were being created that the regime was feeding on, but they were being created from the outside. So it took a while for the Kurds and the Baluch and the Arabs to join in, like the different ethnicities of Iran to join into the protest. But they did. But I think what was important is this time you saw a few characteristics that I will explain what has led for them to become visibly seen this time around. We saw organized resistance on the ground. We saw going on the offensive. We saw that within the first few hours of the start of the protest, the slogans were directly at the overthrow of the regime. So down with the dictator, down with Khamenei. Khamenei is your final year, and this is the real year of your overthrow and your demise. And also slogans like no to the crown, no to the turban, freedom and democracy, or things like that, that came out mostly from the universities in Iran. So, step by step, we're seeing that evolve. I think that, especially in the last 10 years, part of it is the role that the resistance units have played inside of Iran, because since about 14 years ago, the Iranian resistance announced its strategy of creating resistance units on the ground that serve as underground units that can organize locally, but then when the time comes, they can evolve into a national liberation army for the people of Iran. And so the Iranian resistance has been concentrating on the strategy for the past 12, 13 years or so. We've seen it grow every year. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers for 2025 because the final days of 2025, the uprisings began and our concentration has been there. But in 2024, for instance, the resistance units carried out over 39,000 activities throughout Iran, and they targeted over 3,000 centers of oppression. In every city, in every province, these activities were taking place on daily basis. So in the mindsets of people, these things have been setting in. People knew this time around. That's what everyone is saying. People knew what they were supposed to do when they came to the streets. Why do they know what to do? Because they have been seeing it, even if they don't put it together instantly, but they have been seeing this in the back set of their minds. It's being done. It's been, the messages have been there, their activities have been there, they've seen it, they've heard about it. And so when this time comes, they're like, oh, this is what you're supposed to do now. This is how you're supposed to go on the offensive. This is how we need to organize together. If we're alone, if they catch us alone, they're going to kill us. So we need to support one another. We need to help one another. We need to organize. We need to do this. We need to do that. So those resistance units actually were able to multiply in the scenes, in the protests, and to be able to push forward. we are seeing that evolved step by step throughout these years. And I think that is why, if you look, especially in the past year and a half, the Iranian regime has really been concentrating on the resistance units to have them arrested, executed. Just in 2022, over 3,600 members of the resistance units or those who were affiliated with it were arrested or disappeared during the uprisings in 2022. In the last year and a half, 20 something, about 25 people have been sentenced to execution on charges of being members of resistance units. And two of them have been executed. The rest are currently on death row in Iran. But we saw them giving messages out of prison during the uprisings, telling people to stand, resist, this is the right path, without fear. And that kind of bravery, it creates bravery. That message resonates with people when they see 2 years now, we have seen the Tuesdays against execution in the prisons throughout Iran. So every Tuesdays, these prisoners, which were mostly political prisoners to start with, but it's grown to other prisoners too, they go on hunger strike every Tuesday and they start chanting in the prisons of the regime against the regime in its entirety and for the downfall of the regime. That takes bravery because they know that they have to pay the price that day or the next day, but they still do it. And they have done it constantly, and it grew from one prison to 54 prisons throughout the country. So and then every week they give out a statement. And it's a long story how they actually get these statements out. They've even actually been able to give out audio messages from the prison. Like someone has a call with their families and they just play the sounds, or it's planned. So on a Tuesday when they're processing, for someone to have a phone call so they will hear what's going on in prison. And just last week, actually, we had the you know the audio of one of the prisons. For me, even though I know this, it was startling. I was like, at a time that 50,000 people have been detained and the regime is threatening that we're going to have all of you killed. This is this chance coming out. And this is how they show their solidarity with those who are on the streets and telling them to continue. And I think this is like a chain. I mean, this has a domino effect on Iran society. And these are all very important signs. And I think that, yes, step by step, that every time the Iranian resistance has learned from it based on its analysis and the work that they do, they try to be prepared for the next step and for the next uprising, and trying to shorten the time and to make it consistent and make it to continue until the downfall of the regime. We know that unfortunately comes with a very high cost. This regime it's clear since 1981, this regime is not going to go without a fight. And that's why we keep on emphasizing on recognize the right of the Iranian people to resist in face of this regime. That is what the West can do. We don't want your troops, we don't want your money, we don't want anything like that. We just want you to recognize our right to be able to fight. And the Iranian resistance has reiterated time and time again. Mrs. Rajavi, the president-elect of the Iranian resistance, has said for 20 years now that the solution to Iran is neither war nor appeasement. It's supporting the Iranian people and their resistance, organized resistance to bring about change. And also she has highlighted that the solution, because right now a lot of people are saying, what happens next? If this regime falls, what happens next? And the scenario that's fed is people have to choose between the current regime or the previous. Well, the Iranian people are not stuck choosing between a theocracy and a classical dictatorship. They want to move forward. You don't have to choose between the present and the past dictatorships. You can move forward to a secular democratic republic where there will be people's, sovereignty, and that, I think Iran plays a very important geopolitical role in the region. And just imagine if it actually serves as a stabilizing force in the region and is a true democracy that can bear fruit in the region too, because usually when something happens in Iran, it has this domino effect on the region. When Dr. Mossadegh nationalized oil, we saw its repercussions in the region, in Egypt and everywhere else. And then when Islamic fundamentalism came into Iran, unfortunately, we saw that too, and how it spread in the region. So just imagine if we have like a democratic force, and a democratic force that is led by a woman. I think that can really be a major stepping stone and very important. And I think the 10-point plan that Mrs. Rajavi has presented is also, I mean, it's a concrete roadmap. It's derived from the plans of the National Council of Resistance, everyone. It's not just like 10 points. It comes from, hundreds of pages of plans and everything that have been put together by the National Council of Resistance of Iran for over 40 years. A lot of people have called Mrs. Ravi's 10-point plan like Jeffersonian. The reason is because it has all of those bases of like the Constitution. I mean, separation of religion and state, rule of people like ballot box is the final criterion. The abolition of the death penalty and execution the death penalty and torture in all its forms, gender equality and actually gender equity, that all ethnicities have equal rights and the autonomy of the different ethnicities in Iran, or like for instance the as I said, separation of church and state, and for people to be treated truly as equals, non-nuclear Iran, all of that. I mean, a free market economy, all of it. I think that it's a litmus test for Iran. I mean, if you put this ahead, then you could negotiate on anything else, right? Because it has those basics and it guarantees certain things, and it's a guarantee that, we could fall on the right track. Unfortunately, I mean, we know that it's not going to be overnight, but I think that it will provide those rail guards to make sure that we go on the right path forward and to be able to build that true democracy that's needed, um, and the people of Iran deserve.
You mentioned that the regime tends to wait between presidencies. So they'll do something and an administration will take a hard line and they'll just sit back and wait until that administration is gone and then try to get a way forward again through the new presidency. And that's indicative of something that the United States foreign policy tends to be, is very wishy-washy when it comes to how we deal with our allies and our adversaries, because of the fact that it's all based off of presidential decree right now. Has the resistance ever considered, and I know you've walked the halls of Congress, but has the resistance ever considered lobbying Congress to push for a more sustainable and I guess solid baseline for the foreign policy with regards to Iran, like allowing Congress to establish that the United States policy towards Iran will be that we support the right of the Iranian people to self-govern? And that establishing that tells the president, hey, you don't get to decide what the policy is anymore when it comes to Iran. This is what the policy is. And having that more permanent solution there, do you think that would help in the process, or do you think that it would have no impact whatsoever?
The reality is that this is something that is being um this is something that is being done right now, and it's been done for 4 decades, continuously. This is, it's something that needs to be done, continuously. It's not something that you do once and then, it bears fruits. Right now, the Iranian American community in the U.S. is very active on Capitol Hill. I think that the fact that if you look in the last 10 years, every year there has been a resolution on Iran with majority support. Even in these years that there has been a lot of tension in the US, but still bipartisan support has still continued to be there for the Iranian resistance and for the 10-point plan of Mrs. Rajabi. So that has been continued. Like even if you look at the statement, the resolution from last year, there is a clause in it about the right to resist and, right to, defend yourself. For the Iranian people to have that right to defend themselves in face of the IRGC and whatnot. So step by step, it has had impacts on certain aspects of foreign policy in Iran. I mean, because as I said, unfortunately, Iranian people and the Iranian resistance have been used as bargaining chips throughout these years. It's been mostly used to counter that, um, counter that effect. But it has also moved in the positive process too, and especially in the last decade. So that is something that continues, and that is something that does happen. How much of an effect does it have on U.S. policy? It has had its effect. I can't say it hasn't been without effect, but it is much more complex than being able to have that effect so fast. It has had effect. There have been former foreign secretaries who have actually attested to it, both behind closed doors and both publicly. So we have seen the effect, and we have been told, the work that you guys are doing is really effective, and it's not something that can be that you can close your eyes on. And that continuation and that consistency in that messaging that you guys have, and that kind of dedication, because there are people who are on Capitol Hill who have been there for decades, but for decades they have also seen that the Iranian resistance has always constantly been there. As I said, from the early 1980s till today, they have consistently worked. I don't think you could find 1 month in the last 44 years, at least, that the Iranian diaspora has not been on Capitol Hill working. 1 month. I don't think you could find 1 month in the past 44 years. So that consistency, that speaks volumes, I think, because that kind of dedication is really what's needed. And what's important is also, as I said, I think one of the strongholds of this movement is the fact that it's always been able to, because it moves forward based on its principles and its values. So it has been able to consistently have bipartisan support. And I think that has been very key. See people who might not agree on a lot of things, but when it comes to this resistance, they stand together and they're united in that voice, and that just speaks, I think, volumes of the moral compass of this movement, and the fact that it's not one, unlike what we just mentioned. That I mean, a lot of politicians, they change their position based on what's popular and what's not. This movement has never changed its positions based on popularity. They have always, their position has always been based on principle and values, even at times that they weren't, what was popular. Like for instance, back in 1990s, I remember there was Khatami came into power in 1996, and there was all this talk about myth of moderation in Iran and reform and whatever. And the Iranian resistance, the day after that election, or so-called election, and the day after that selection, the Iranian resistance gave a statement said, "A viper never gives birth to a dove." This regime has proven time and time again that it's not reformable. They're just trying to buy time this way, because it was after Khomeini had died, after Rafsanjani, so they wanted to start this new wave of to try to buy time with Western powers. We want, dialogue of civilizations and this and that. But in reality, they were still carrying out executions, and they were doing this and that. The core of the regime hadn't changed. The regime was pursuing its nuclear program then. The world did not know about it at all. So the face was, dialogue of civilizations behind closed doors. It was the Khobar Towers. It was, the executions and killings. It was the nuclear program that was continuing and was being worked on. So they stood their ground, and after a few years, the world realized that, hey, the resistance was right and they were wrong in regards to, believing in reform being possible in this regime. So yeah.
Yeah, so I guess what I was referring to is more along the lines of, and you brought up the nuclear program. So, for example, when the Iran nuclear deal went through the process under President Obama, that was signed as an executive agreement, which was then promptly overturned by President Trump. And that's one of those situations where I see, from the point of view of, had Congress ratified that agreement, it would have made it much more difficult for President Trump to overturn that, which would have allowed us to at least continue to keep the pressure on the regime and prevent them from continuing the process, or to put them on notice and saying that the United States has permanent policy and we are going to hold you to that permanent policy. So resolutions, they're great, but they're a bark with no teeth in my experience and understanding of congressional resolutions. So I guess from your point of view, do you think that congressional action, like, for example, the ratification of the nuclear arms deal, do you think that that would have been something that would have been more beneficial to the revolution than just a simple resolution?
I mean, it's kind of like in the middle of the way when you say it that way, because first of all, the JCPOA was weak. The reality is that, and also the regime really dragged its feet on that, so it bought itself a lot of time. And in the negotiations, they were able to get a lot of benefits out of it too. It was good to have a deal. We were glad that there was the JCPOA, but we knew that it was a weak resolution. I mean, to be honest, and there's a lot of holes in it right now. I mean, if you look at the whole process, I mean, since 2002. Iran's nuclear program was first revealed by the NCRI US office in August 2002. Right now we're in 2026. I mean, the nuclear program is still continuing. The world really dragged its feet in this regard. They could have done a lot more and we would have been in a different state. I think that the reality is that each administration, they come in with certain political, you know, messaging and, promises that they make, and they just want to make sure that they get that done because of their voters and everything. The JCPOA was in this regard too, because they just wanted to get it done to say we did what we promised. And President Trump's reaction was also that he immediately removed it because that is what he had promised to. But they don't think of the long term even interest for the international community in the US, unfortunately. Either one. So I think
Mhm.
that from the beginning it should have been something that goes through Congress to be able to have it needed more back and forth. It couldn't the negotiations that were being carried out in New York and here and there in regards to the JCPOA. I mean, the fact that if you look at all the pictures, you see like the lobbyists of the Iranian regime all lined and present in those conferences. You could tell like it was also serving Iranian in the regime from the fact that you treat a Parsi and this and that were all there. You could tell, and unfortunately, the US administrations, both the current and the previous, have hired people in the State Department thinking that these are the ones who understand Iran, but they're Iran lobbyists. And they're well known, it's documented. People have raised alarms on it, but unfortunately they are still in office, right? And they're still working in the State Department. So, I mean, there's a lot of flaws in the whole system, I think. So, you have to fix it from the base and not just in the middle of the way try to. But yes, of course, I think that if Congress had more of a role, it could be beneficial both for the US and for the Iranian people. And I think this goes for a lot of different issues. It's not just the issue of Iran, but in general, yes. But it is what it is, unfortunately. Those are things that can't be changed that easily. I mean, you have
That
to
is a phrase
understand
that we
that
use in the
we
Marine
do
Corps
have like the
all the
checks and
time.
balances for a reason. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess this would be the final question, and then we can move on to you telling the viewers how to find you and follow your movement, maybe even provide a little support. But final question: once, not if, but when, and the revolution finally gets to a point where Iran is the democracy and the secular government that the Iranian Revolution wants it to be, where does the revolutionary leadership where do you see Iran with regards to the international stage? Like, what type of a role do you think that Iran would have in a post Khamenei and freedom loving democratic society?
We hope that we see that day soon. But I think that first of all, when you have the number one state sponsor of international terrorism eliminated, that makes a difference in the world. It also makes a difference in the world when the roots or the head of the snake of terrorism, but also Islamic fundamentalism is pulled out. Because unfortunately, back in 1997, I think for the first time, the Iranian resistance said the new global threat is Islamic fundamentalism. The book came out, the statement came out. People didn't pay attention to it until 9/11 happened, and they realized, hey, there was something there that this resistance was emphasizing on. So if once you have removed those elements, I mean, just all the proxy groups in the region will fall apart because Iran is not there anymore. I think that we will enter a new era, which could lead to a stable Middle East. We can finally see. I really think that Iran can be a stabilizing force, a peaceful nation, a nation that's has neighborly relations with its neighboring countries, and I think that we can see that prosperity grow in the region, and it could be a stabilizing force. Also, I think that you have to understand Iran, not to be biased here, but we have the greatest brain drain in the world. And just imagine all of those Iranians actually being able to serve their own people. And unfortunately, our elites inside of the country are I mean, when you look at the political prisoners right now in prison in Iran, they are the cream of the crop of Iran society. but unfortunately, some of them have been in prison for decades. So just imagine these people actually serving their own people. And I think that we will see a Iran that will flourish, and I think it'll have its effects on the entire world. Also, I think that Iran, where I don't think anyone can undermine or question the fact that no matter who does come into power in Iran, but we will see women as the force of change in Iran because women play a major role in the Iranian resistance and in the fight for freedom in Iran. And I think that when you see that flourish in the region where unfortunately misogyny is on the rise, I think that that will have its impact everywhere around the world to have that example because like for instance in our movement right now since 1993 the Iranian resistance has been fully led by female leadership in all its
That
ranks.
is amazing.
And this is not just like because in the international community, when you look at it, or just look in the last 30, or 20, 30 years, there have been female leaders who have been able to rise, but in a male dominant way or role. So it was an individual that overcame those obstacles and became that leader. So it wasn't a it's not something that's systematic. But like in the Iranian resistance, what Mrs. Rajabi has done, and I think this is like one of her greatest accomplishment that the world has yet to learn about because we have been so concentrated on the fight against the regime that there hasn't really been time to speak about it. But she was chosen as, you know, co-leader of this resistance by by the resistance. And she didn't stop there. She was like, I'm not an exception to the rule. She created like a whole generation or generations of female leaders who are all capable of, you know, accomplishing so much. And what they have done is actually you could see a lot of teamwork in the leadership. So it has created something that withstands the test of time and is able to be consistent. And I think that, you know, because there isn't any rivalry there, they're working, you know, towards the same cause or putting something above themselves, and that's what are the interests of the Iranian people. So I think that there's a lot to learn from that. I remember back in actually in March we will be celebrating the it's Beijing plus 30. So there was a first Beijing World Conference on women. It was held in Beijing in 1996. And at that time, Hillary Clinton, who was First Lady, she attended. And there in her speech, she said, women's rights are human rights. And that was at the time, like everyone was like, wow, that is such a progressive idea that rights are human rights. At that time, it had been 3 years that the Iranian resistance was being led by complete female leadership in all its ranks. To us, it was, you know, I was like, of course, women's rights are human rights. Women are the force for change. I mean, these were things that I think, like for instance, my generation, like or generations who were girls, like I was a teenager back then, but having such role models really changed my mindset. I didn't have, I mean, even growing up in the US, I didn't have a lot of the glass ceilings that a lot of girls my age did because I had these examples in front of me. And I think that just that impact in itself can create such a wave in the positive wave because Mrs. Rajavi always says for us, you know, women in leadership is or in hegemony, it's not an issue of it's not feminism or you know, it's nothing like that. This is the path to emancipation of human beings, both men and women, because everyone has so much energy that is now enshackled with these gender roles. So if you break that apart, there's so much potential in every human being to, you know, become so much more and do so much more and actually use their energies, which is right now just enchained. So I think that there's a lot to be said there. So I really think that Iran can really play a major role and become a major stabilizing force and example for many, both in the social realm and in the political realm. And as I said, geopolitically, Iran has always played an important role. So I think that it would be good for it to play a positive position there and role there. And we hope to see that day soon.
And that would be an Iran that I would love to visit and practice my Daryan Farsi in. With that being said, Zolal, tell me a little bit about your movement, where my followers can find you guys and learn more about what you guys are doing.
Well, the Iranian resistance is present on social media and on the internet. So you could visit To learn more about the National Cancer Resistance of Iran, you could visit ncr-iran.org. To learn more about Mariam Majavi, I mean, her website is in 4 different languages, so people could visit that. It's mariam-rajavi.com. But there's also a website that's called um, mariamrajaviforchange.com. That one, it's easier to understand. It's not daily news, it's more the ideas and what she stands for and what she presents. So that's a good one to go to. If you would like to be in contact with the Iranian American community in the US, there's OIAC. It's the Organization of Iranian American Communities, oiac.org. And in Europe or anywhere else, Canada, whatnot, you could visit iranfreedom.org and they could put you in contact with the different chapters in different countries to be in contact and be active. And on social media, you can find all of those that I mentioned, especially in X mostly because X is more political platform. But if you would like to, if you have any questions or would you like to reach out to me directly, I think searching my name might be easier because the handles might be a bit difficult, but my Instagram and X handles are Ashrafi Forever, and LinkedIn you can find me with Zolal Habibi.
Excellent. Well, Zolal, thank you again for coming on the show, and best of luck to you. I know I'm going to be following you and your movement. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you.